Good morning. I'm here today to talk about wastewater management in Sonoma County. What I'm really, when I say Sonoma County, I'm really referring to the Santa Rosa Plain, which includes from Cotati to Windsor, and those are the areas I'm going to be concentrating on. As a little bit of a primer, I'd like to go over some terminology. Amy? We're not clicking. Okay, thank you. So, let's back up. To start out with, wastewater, and that's water that is flushed down the toilet. Everyone familiar with that? What we're talking about? Okay, great. So there's really, in the process that we use here in Sonoma County, there's really three major steps. The first is primary treatment. The water comes in and it goes through screens. They're called bar screens, but in our case, they're big stainless steel plates with 1-inch holes in them, and that takes out anything that doesn't dissolve in the water, such as paper, cloth, kids' toys. You'd be surprised how many of those get flushed down the toilet. And then it goes into these primary settling tanks. What happens in the primary settling tank is the water goes in, it just basically sits there for a few hours. The heavier solids settle to the bottom, and the floating grease and oils go to the top and are skimmed off, and the heavy solids are raked to one side and they're pumped out of the tank. After that, the water flows to the secondary treatment process. This is really the workhorse of the treatment system. A secondary process has an oxidation component. At our plant, we use activated sludge, but an aerated pond, a lot of wineries, they use aerated ponds. You'll see the little aerators out there flowing, spreading the water up and down. You can also have a trickling filter. That's an older style secondary treatment. So there are a variety of secondary treatments. In secondary treatment, also, there's a process called nitrification, denitrification. And what's happening here is in wastewater, when it comes to the plant, there's a lot of ammonia in it. And we've designed the tanks so we have a long enough detention time in the tanks and the right type of bacteria, and they break that ammonia down to nitrate. And then if you look in here, there's no bubbles there. There's bubbles here, so we're putting air into the water. There's no bubbles here. And what happens here is that nitrate water that's been converted from ammonia goes into this area, and these bacteria need air to live. And so what they do is they scavenge the oxygen off the nitrate molecules, and what's left is nitrogen gas, which is off gases in the atmosphere. And so that further reduces the nitrate levels in the water. So nitrate's a natural fertilizer, and if you're discharging, you don't really want that in the water. The second part of the secondary treatment is settling. So the activated sludge goes into this center part of the clarifier, and it settles down. There's a steel skirt here, and it settles under that skirt, and then the cleaner water flows over these, we call them weirs, and then it flows out, and then it goes to tertiary treatment. Tertiary treatment is a filtration process. We use anthracite carbon. Some plants use just sand or a synthetic media. What we do is we have a bed of this material about 4 feet thick, and the water just percolates through it. This is the filter structure. Not a particularly great slide, but the water comes in here, and it just percolates through that bed. The last process is disinfection. We used to use chlorine, but now we use ultraviolet light. Most plants in the United States still use chlorine, but handling chlorine, we use the pure gas liquid chlorine, which was pure. It's very toxic. You have to have a lot of special handling equipment. So when we made the decision to go to UV, we were looking at upgrading our chlorine system, and it was going to be very expensive. So the decision was made to go to UV. And I have to say that I think UV is the trend of the future in the wastewater industry. It's really taking off. Here's a close-up of the lights. Essentially, the water, it's just high-intensity UV bulbs, and the water flows through, and the UV light disrupts the RNA and the DNA of the bacteria, and they die. Okay, a little bit of history and how we got to where we are. Starting in 1950, before that, Santa Rosa owned property. We still own it. It's where the municipal service center is for the city. And they had large, they were basically large septic tanks, big redwood tanks. But after the war, the decision was made to upgrade the treatment system. So the West College treatment plant was built in 1950. It was a trickling filter plant, so it was secondary. And it had a capacity roughly to treat about 5 million gallons a day of water. That's a dry weather flow, and I'll get into that. So that was for the main part of the city. In 1964, there was a little plant in Oakmont built. It's now been decommissioned, but in 1964, that Oakmont treatment plant was built, and it treated the water. They used the water in the summertime for the golf course, and in the winter they discharged into Santa Rosa Creek. And by the way, the West College treatment plant also discharged into Santa Rosa Creek. And then in 1967, the Laguna treatment plant was built. This was in response to growth in southwest Santa Rosa. This was rated at 2 million gallons a day, this plant. Kind of take a look at this picture because we'll see it again at the end of the, whoops, we'll go back there. This is the admin building, primary structure, and aeration tanks. So pretty small at that time. And these are all secondary treatment plants. Rohnert Park and Sebastopol at that time had oxidation pond treatment systems. They were just pond systems where the water flows in, multiple ponds, and they were aerated, so you got a secondary type process treatment. So, in the late 60s, there was a large outcry about water pollution. Many of the waterways in the country were polluted. I think there was a river in Ohio that caught fire. That was kind of a watershed event. You may have remembered it. And as a response to that, Congress passed the Clean Water Act. And what the Clean Water Act did, it did several things. The first thing it did was establish a National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES. And what that was a permitting system where all point source, that's a pipe, dischargers would have to get a permit, and they would have to meet certain discharge requirements in order to discharge, and if they weren't, they would be fined. It also provided money for treatment plant upgrades. Since treatment plants are expensive for the most part, and a lot of cities and counties and agencies didn't have that kind of money to bring up the levels of treatment that they wanted, money was provided in grants. So the federal government, for the most part, would give a city or an agency an 80% grant, and then the agency would pay the other 20%. And it also established state and regional boards to administer the permit and actually monitor the water quality. So they're like the EPA's eyes in the field, if you will. They also, so the regional board's formed, and the regional board here, North Coast Regional Board, comes up with a Russian River Basin Plan. And what it did was no summer discharge from May 15th through October 1st. Any discharge would have to be 1% of the receiving water flow. And the river had to reach 1,000 CFS before we could discharge, before the discharge could commence. Okay. So, those things were proposed. Well, at that time, everyone discharged year-round. That was, Oak Bond, the West College Treatment Plant, Laguna Plant, Sebastopol, Runner Park. So what they decided to do was to expand the Laguna Plant. That was the one I showed a little picture of. So in the early 70s, they started designing it. Construction started in 74 and went through 75, 76. And it took in all the water from Runner Park, Katati, Sebastopol, and it essentially closed the West College Treatment Plant. However, they kept the West College Treatment Plant for winter storm flows. And I'll get into that a little bit more in a minute. Those plants were decommissioned. And the Laguna Treatment Plant was rated at a 15 million gallons a day average dry weather flow. Now, when it rains, there's a thing called I&I, which is inflow and infiltration. And what that is, first of all, inflow is just direct connections to the sewer, like a roof drain that drains into the sewer, or a manhole that has holes in it and the water just leaks directly in. And infiltration is a lot of older sewer pipes. They're clay pipes. You've probably seen them. That was pretty common until the 70s. They used clay instead of plastic. And those pipes, they leak the joints sometimes, or roots can get in them, cause cracks. So you have infiltration when the ground gets saturated. So what happens when you have a big storm? The flow to the plant vastly increases. It can double, triple. The Laguna plant was only rated about 30 million gallons. That's all the water it could handle. It couldn't really pump any more than that. Later on, that's important. So when they had a big storm, what they did was they started up the West College Treatment Plant to take care of the excess flow. And they also were building a Laguna effluent disposal system so they could irrigate the water in the summertime and that included storage ponds and contracts with farmers to take the water, and the city also bought up about 1,400 acres of farmland, and they put irrigation on that so we could irrigate directly ourselves. So they did all those things, and the system worked great. There was no summer discharge. They discharged in the winter. There was only one plant. Everything was fine. In 1985, getting up to 1985, from the late 70s through the early 80s, there's a lot of growth in the Santa Rosa area. If you've lived here for a long time, you probably can remember it was like boom times. And the flow had gradually increased over the years, but they hadn't really done anything to address that issue. And in 1985, it was a relatively dry winter. And 1% of the river flow was really not sufficient for the plant flow. In other words, they were taking in more water than they could discharge, and they were stored in the ponds, but the ponds were filling up. Now, what happened was the city decided to just dump all the water at one time. I'm not sure what thought process went into this decision. I wasn't here at that time. And all those managers that were here were gone. So they discharged about 750 million gallons of secondary treated water over a 4 to 5 day period. Now, the story got picked up and it ran into the San Francisco papers and papers around the state that the city was discharging sewage and it came across as raw sewage. That wasn't really true. However, what had happened at about 2 weeks before, they had had a storm. Even though it was a dry winter, they had a storm. And for some reason, they didn't put the West College treatment plant online. Maybe they didn't think the storm was going to be big enough. But the flow came up, and since they could only handle a certain amount, they did what they call throttling the inlet gates. We have, in the sewer lines, there's gates, big gate valves, and they can throttle them, so only what they could pump could come into the plant. Well, what that does, it backs up water in the system. And there was a manhole right before the plant came onto the plant, and that overflowed about 5 million gallons of raw sewage. So there was a raw sewage overflow. But when the actual release happened 2 weeks later, it was all secondary treated water. So, and it made up about 20% of the river flow, by the way. And there was a huge public outcry, and it was a public relations nightmare, and the city was sued. As a result of that, the regional board issued a cease and desist order that we had to get away from relying on solely on the river as for discharge. In other words, it was a weather-dependent system, and we had to move away from it being a weather-dependent system. So immediately what they did, and this is like 86, 87, 88, it expanded the irrigation system. They put on got more contracts for irrigation. They got pumps for the farmers, better pumps. And they paid them money if they reached a certain level of irrigation. Well, that's always a big incentive right there if you get paid some money to irrigate. The tertiary treatment went online in 1989. What that meant was we could use the water for unlimited irrigation. So we could use it for urban irrigation. So at that time, the golf courses in Rohnert Park were put online. So they've used our water since 1989. And they expanded the plant capacity. They expanded the dry weather flow up to about 18 million gallons a day, but they expanded the wet weather, the hydraulic capacity, up to about 70 million gallons a day. And they started the EIR for a long-term weather-independent project. So the first EIR was completed in 1990. And it selected an agricultural reuse with storage. Now, the storage component was controversial. The irrigation wasn't controversial. Most of the farmers wanted it, but the siting of the storage pond, large storage pond, was very controversial. So the city sued again. EIR was ruled inadequate due to that not all alternatives were studied at project level detail. In that EIR, they had mentioned the geysers, they had mentioned an ocean outfall, they had mentioned a South County ag project, but those basically in that EIR process, they selected the ag project, and they just only superficially studied those other projects. So it took about 3 years or so for this all to transpire and the EIR to get thrown out in court. So we started the second EIR project in 1994. And all the projects were going to be studied in project level detail. That EIR was completed in 1998. And it had a storage component with agri use, and it was still controversial. It had, there was a South County project where they were talking about the Tole Lake area and using that. In my opinion, that was dead on arrival, but it was still in there. They had the West County project, which was essentially the same one they had studied before, but they also had the Geysers project and a couple of other projects. And before the EIR was completed, Calpine purchased most of the power plants at the Geysers. Before, there had been like 3 or 4 companies. Unical had some, PG&E had some. And anyway, Calpine purchased all the power plants, and they consolidated the operation. Not quite all of them. There's still a couple independent ones up there. But so Calpine offered to partner with the city on the project and pay for the pumping costs. Now, this was really the stumbling block of the Geysers project from the beginning. A lot of people liked the Geysers project, but it costs about $3 million a year just to pump the water up the hill. So for them to pay for that was a big deal. And they were also willing to put in a pump station on their property and all the distribution piping to get it through the steam field. So the Geysers option was selected, and we didn't get sued. So the design started in 1991 and went through 2001. Actually, construction started in 2000 before all the components of the process were completed. We were still working on the pump stations when they started building the pipeline. There was 8 separate construction contracts, and that included 4 pump stations and 41 miles of pipeline. And it went online in 2003, and it was on time. I'd like to say it was under budget, but I can't. It was just on time. So here they are, laying pipe. This is a let's go back to that. This is a 48-inch pipeline. It's a 48-inch pipe. It's 48-inch pipe all the way up to Red Winery Road. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's really kind of where in Alexander Valley where it starts to go up Pine Flat Road to the top of the ridge. So it's 48 inches all the way to there, and from there it's 30 inches on up. So here, welders welding inside. This is high pressure to get the water lifted up the hill. The pipe, we have to deal with very high pressures. So a lot of the pipe is welded joints, which is somewhat unusual. Here they are installing, going up one of the ridges. You can kind of see it. It's actually a lot steeper than it looks, and it looks pretty steep there. The part of the pipeline went through an Audubon sanctuary, and as part of that, we were requested to kind of camouflage the pump stations. So it's kind of, they try to blend in. The other thing though, that was easy. The hard part was we could only have a 5 decibel increase over the surrounding area. Well, if you ever drive up Pine Flat Road and you sit outside, it's pretty quiet. So basically 5 decibels above quiet is still quiet. In order to do that, this is the inside of a pump station. There's 3 pump stations that look just like that. And most pumps, most pump motors are air-cooled. They have fins, and well, these are water-cooled motors, so they actually have a little water jacket, and water circulates through it, and it cools it. They're quieter. They can be quieter. It's pretty rare, but you can do it. Here, this is the last section up to the terminal reservoir. This is one of the power plants. This is these loops. That's the steam piping. So there's steam wells and injection wells. The steam comes out of the wells, and it goes to a turbine. And just like any other power plant, the steam turns the turbine, and then it goes through a cooling tower. A lot of the water that we send up there is actually used in the cooling tower to recondense the steam, and then it's re-injected into the ground. A little bit about the process. How it works is the water goes up there and they start to pump it, but when it gets going, these are very deep wells. They're anywhere from 12 to 15,000 feet deep, so very deep wells. And in the Geysers area, there's the rock is fractured, and water can percolate through those fractures, and the magma is fairly close to the surface in that area, so it's hot, and it just produces steam. It naturally produces steam. If you go up there, there's still some areas where the steam is coming out of the ground naturally. And they've got, Calpine has about 15 power plants. Here's another one. And then there's two other companies that have power plants. The total production, maximum production from the steam field right now is about 900 megawatts, which is a lot. I mean, basically, all the power for Lake, Sonoma, Napa, and Marin counties come from the geysers. I mean, it goes into the grid and it's distributed everywhere, but essentially, that power produces all the power for those counties. And we still have our irrigation system. We currently irrigate about 6,400 acres. That includes 650 acres of urban irrigation, includes all the parks and schools in Rohnert Park. It includes some parks in Santa Rosa. It includes the Mountain Shadows or Foxdale Golf Course. We have about 1,800 acres of vineyards on our system, and we have about 33 miles of distribution piping, which we send the water out to those areas. And as I said before, the city owns about 1,400 acres. Here's some pictures of a vineyard where we irrigate. Here's some row crops. The water is improved for unlimited irrigation of food crops. This is actually an organic farm. We uses our water. This is kind of, we don't do this so much anymore. The user doesn't do it this much anymore. I guess vineyards were more profitable than grass, so we planted vineyards here, but we used to do turf irrigation. When you go along Highway 101, before you get to Katati, there you'll see a big vineyard off to your left, and Gallo owns that vineyard. And it's a pretty big vineyard. It's about 350 acres, and they have a pond, and we pump the water up to the pond. Pond's right there. And and then they just use that water throughout the year. Sonoma State University, it's all irrigated with recycled water. This is Finley Park in Santa Rosa. This is a aerial photograph with our pipelines overlaid on it for Rohnert Park. So the treatment plant's right here, and we have storage ponds. This is low pressure distribution, and then we have a pump station right here, and it's pressurized, and it sends the water all the way to Sonoma State, and then we have these laterals throughout the city, and those little purple dots are sites where we irrigate. So, if you remember, before we only could irrigate, or we only irrigated in the summertime, and all the water had to be discharged in the winter. So now, in a dry year, we discharge 1% or less. This year, it's been pretty dry. We're not going to discharge any water. So about 66% or 2/3 will go through the geysers, and about 1/3 will be irrigated. We still can't, because of the I&I situation, where we get really large flows to the plant, especially if it's prolonged, like when we had the flood in 2005, 2006, had a lot of water to deal with. We still discharge. We actually haven't had to discharge up to 25%, but theoretically we could, in a really wet year, if we had like a 97, 98 El Nino year, or a tremendous amount of rain, we probably might discharge that much. And in that case, about 54% would go to the geysers, and irrigation would get about 21%. Our discharge itself is highly regulated, and I'd like to talk a little bit about that briefly. We've kind of consolidated to our largest pond, which is our Delta Pond, and how we do it is we have these things called data sondes, and what they are is they're a probe, and they measure dissolved oxygen, pH, turbidity, temperature, and electroconductivity. And we put one in the pond, and we put one in the receiving water, which happens to be Santa Rosa Creek. And these are hooked to what we call a SCADA system, which stands for System Control and Data Acquisition. And that information is transferred every 15 minutes to our control system, our computers at the plant. In addition, the flow of Santa Rosa Creek measured at the Willowside Bridge is also transmitted. And it takes that information and it calculates how much we can discharge without affecting the temperature or the DO in the creek. And then it sends a signal to some automatic motorized valves with a flow meter, and it just adjusts them. So before we did this, we would adjust once a day, but because really now the main limiting factor is temperature, because the water in the pond stays a pretty constant level, where the water in the creek changes, and we can only raise the temperature in the creek a certain amount. So if the water in the pond is a little warmer, it limits how much we can discharge. And before, when we were doing it, just going out manually and adjusting every day, sometimes we'd have temperature excursions. With this system, we don't have to worry about that because it automatically adjusts. So, as we've also had increased regional cooperation besides Roanoke Park and Toddy Sebastopol. Sonoma County Water Agency connected to our system in 2004 from their airport plant. So they are not able to discharge. They don't have a discharge component from the airport plant. So if they have times where they have excess water, they transfer it into our system and we just irrigate it. And in Windsor, they can also transfer water from the airport plant to the airport plant, so they can work together because Windsor can discharge. And then Windsor, a couple years ago, they started looking at, they were kind of in the same boat that we used to be in, where they had trouble getting rid of all the water by discharge, and so they went through an EIR process and they looked at expanded irrigation, but ultimately hooking into the geysers was a lot cheaper than trying to expand the irrigation system themselves. So they built a pump station at their treatment plant and they hooked into the geysers in 2011, which they've been gloriously happy actually. And you can't really see this map too well, but it's really the scale that I wanted to show. The areas in beige are properties that are irrigated by the City of Santa Rosa, Laguna Treatment Plant. This is the geysers pipeline. And these areas here are Sonoma County Water Agency's area irrigation, and the blue is Windsor. So they all kind of overlap. There's a lot of vineyards up here that kind of all run together. And that's the Windsor treatment plant. No. That's the Windsor treatment plant. That's the airport treatment plant. So the Windsor, they just tied in right there. So essentially the water's being managed in the Santa Rosa Plain kind of through irrigation and geysers, and everyone's able to meet their permit requirements these days. Laguna plant today, it's full tertiary treatment for all the flow. That's even the wet weather flow. We can treat up to 70 million gallons tertiary treatment. We have UV disinfection, which I saw the pictures earlier. We have a nitrification, denitrification to reduce nutrients in the water. We have, it's rated at 21 million gallons average dry weather flow. And we have a compost facility. I didn't really talk about it, but when that heavy solids settles in the primary settling tank, it's pumped to what we call a digester. And a digester is an anaerobic process. And what it does is it breaks down the volatile organic material anaerobically. And the main production is methane and carbon dioxide. We use that methane to run generators at the treatment plant, so we can provide about a quarter of our own energy. And actually, what we do is we mix it with natural gas, and we produce up to 2.4 megawatts of cogeneration right at the treatment plant. The compost facility, after it's digested, it sits in there for about 30 days. It's dewatered, and it goes to the compost facility, and it's composted with wood chips from the county, wood green waste from the county, and then we sell it. Some of it we send out directly to farms in the county, and it's just applied in the summertime directly. We don't compost that. So very little of it, though, the key point is very little goes to the landfill. Nearly all of it's reused. Only about maybe 10% of the biosolids sludge goes to the landfill anymore. So this is a treatment plant today. Kind of remember that little building was the one little building that I pointed out. So these are the primaries. These are the digesters. There's 4 digesters. This is the aeration basins. There's 4 trains here. Each train has 3 tanks. There's 5 secondary clarifiers. This is the filter structure, and this is the UVs over here. That's the compost facility, and these are storage ponds. This is only about 40% of our storage. We have a big pond kind of off Guerneville Road. We call it Delta Pond, and it can hold up to 2,000 acre-feet of water. So that's our biggest storage component. This concrete basin is what we call a flow equalization basin. And what that does, sewage comes into the plant, doesn't come in evenly because people aren't flushing their toilets at night. So the flow really drops off. And in a biological process, it's better if you can kind of maintain a more even flow to the tanks. So what we do is we store water during the day, and then at night we pull that water back, so we have a more even flow. And this is actually kind of the same angle as that first picture. You maybe remember that little road coming in, the little house right there. That's the building there. And this is these green pumps right here. These green pumps right here are for the irrigation distribution, and then these beige pumps are for the Geysers line. And both lines run up along the road. So that's about it for my presentation, and I'll take some questions.
So do we have a few questions? Okay, and remember, we're going to keep the microphone this way, right, Tom? Like this?
Yeah. Will something like the geysers last indefinitely as long as there's water to put down there, or will that hot rock change over time?
From my understanding, well, in geologic time, probably no. But for our time frames, it's not going to go away in the next 100,000 of years. one of the reasons the Geysers wanted the water was they had a big boom of building power plants up there in the 70s and 80s, geothermal power, and they started to overtap the steam, natural steam, and they weren't getting as much steam out of the ground, and so the power production started dropping. This is actually the second project. They have a project where they take water from Clear Lake and some of the treated little Middletown water, and they inject that also. But this project is much larger. This has like about 3 times the capacity of that project. By the way, we can pump up to the Geysers about 19 million gallons a day. Typically, we average about 12 million gallons a day. That's what we're pumping right now, is 12 million gallons a day for the Geysers.
You talked about releasing only a certain amount of water into the Santa Rosa Creek because the temperature change. Could you highlight how that would affect is it the fish population and other species? Could you talk about how that would affect it?
Yes. Basically, what they're worried about is a change in temperature, especially a rapid change in temperature, will affect migration of fish when they're swimming upstream. Could possibly disrupt their migration. So that is the reason for the temperature limitation.
Having grown up in the Midwest, everybody dumped all of their treated water in the rivers, which I guess is what happened here in Santa Rosa in earlier days. Now times have changed here. Have they also changed in the Midwest? And also, do our water bills reflect any increase in cost for the distribution system that we're now using?
Yes.
Okay, well, in the Midwest, they still discharge. It's pretty common. The biggest change there is from the Clean Water Act, they've upgraded their treatment. So everyone's doing at least secondary treatment, and most of them also do nutrient reduction. So they reduce the nitrates and the phosphates in the water they discharge. But they typically just discharge year-round. Your second question is, yes, your sewer bill covers the operational cost of running the sub-regional system, and that's how it's paid for.
In this part of the country, we're called earthquake country. What plans do you have if an earthquake disrupts your pumping to the steam generators or disrupt your own distribution system?
Well, first of all, we have on-site total redundancy with generators, so we can produce our own power if the power is disrupted. If the Geysers pipeline were to break, then we would just have to store the water until we could get it fixed. And we do have the storage ponds. If storage ponds were destroyed, although probably less likely because they're not that high of ponds. They're like the deepest one is 25 feet in their earth embankment. But if that were to happen, then we would have to discharge. That would be the third option.
Into the river.
Into the river. That was great.
My question might seem a little flippant, but I know many people think about just old drugs and medications that they're not using anymore, they flush them. And I've always heard that's not a very good idea. Does it make a difference?
Yes, it does. It actually does make a difference. And right now, one of the kind of hot topics in the wastewater industry is called contaminants of emerging concern. And basically what those are products that mimic estrogen, and they can cause changes in aquatic life. We have a program where you can turn your old medicines into drugstores. They'll take them. Maybe not every drugstore, but I believe quite a few in the Santa Rosa area will take back unused drugs. And although the plant's quite a ways away from here, we have a box at the plant where unused drugs can be taken. So The aeration process actually does, and the UV does break down those to a certain extent, but they don't take it all out. So it's better that those things don't get in the beginning.
You mentioned that there is a small percentage of waste that goes to the landfill. Where is the landfill?
Right now, it's in Solano County. So they have to truck it over. It's over by, you know where Highway 12 splits off from 80, Highway 80 at Fairfield? It's just past that. There's a landfill out there.
But it's trucked over.
It's trucked over. So that's another reason why we want to minimize. I take that back. Some of it goes there, but some of it just goes to the Redwood landfill off 101. So it goes to two places.
I think that you might have partially answered my question already. Excuse me. Do you feel that the UV tertiary treatment actually gets all the pathogens out of the water, or is there still some things that filter through?
I think it does do a good job. It kills all the bacteria. There are some like, I don't want to say bacteria, more like viruses really, that are like, if you want it shielded, and it does probably not do the best job on those, but the bacteria pathogens, it completely kills them.
I would like to know if you personally have a filtration system in your home.
I do, but I have a well. So, yeah, it's just, it's not under sink filtration, but it's like a Brita filter.
Hi.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Hi, my question is about the anaerobic digester. I'm just curious about that system. Do you give tours or instructions about that? And does it break down all the pathogens that go through it?
She's asking about the anaerobic digesters. If we give tours, and does the process break down pathogens? The answer is we do give tours of the plant, the complete plant, and I don't have a lot of cards, but I can give you my card if you want to sign up for a tour. The digesters don't reduce pathogens. What kills the pathogens is the composting process. So when they compost it, they're bringing the temperature up to about 50 degrees centigrade, which is like 140, 150 degrees, and they have to hold it there for 5 days, and that kills the pathogens.
Do we have any other questions? One more. Great, sure.
Yeah, I have two questions. One, the water gets injected into the earth and comes up as steam. And then you said you condense the steam and re-inject it into the wells.
Okay.
I mean, that can't keep going on forever.
Well, it can, and I'll explain how that works. He's asking about the water injection and condensing the steam. So, we inject the water into the ground, comes up in steam. The steam goes to a cooling tower. We're running water through that cooling tower. About 80% of that water going into the cooling tower goes up into the atmosphere while it's recondensing that water. So there's always a loss. If there wasn't a loss, they would have not gotten in trouble in the first place. But so all of the steam that comes out of the ground, only about 20% actually gets re-injected.
Do we have any other questions? Great, thank you so much for